The moment the umbilical latched onto the hull, the ship plunged into darkness. Silent. Absolute. The kind of void where breath felt too loud and instinct clawed at the edges of reason. Emergency power should have kicked in, should have, but didn't. That wasn't a malfunction. That was a knife sliding between ribs before the wound even bled. Wyatt exhaled slow, boots anchored, weapon steady. A subtle shift in air pressure whispered through his armor sensors, a crawling prickle against the skin. They were here. Not a boarding party storming in with brute force. No alarms. No impact tremors, just the creeping weight of something that didn't need doors. Something that moved through the dark like it belonged there. A flicker, just a breath of motion vanished before his eyes locked on it. Neural targeting struggled to track what wasn't there, heat signatures vanishing between scans. Not cloaking. Not jamming. A different kind of erasure. A sound. Barely more than a sigh of metal flexing where no one stood. Then, something colder than the void itself brushed past him. Wyatt fired. The muzzle flash split the dark, but nothing solid took the hit. The rounds passed through empty space, impacting a bulkhead meters away. A whisper, words, maybe? No. Not words. Something deeper, coiling beneath thought. His grip tightened as sweat chilled against his skin. Across the corridor, another breath of movement. Then a scream. Short. Cut off. Not from fear, there hadn't been time. Just gone. A presence erased. The comms crackled once. A single distorted syllable before silence drowned it again. Wyatt's pulse hammered, not from fear, but calculation. These weren't the revenants. Not the standard horrors the Dominion threw at them. This was something else. Something precise. A scalpel where the enemy had always used hammers. Then, from the far end of the corridor, a red glow flared to life. Not light and outline. A shape standing where there had been nothing. No eyes, no face. Just a shifting mass of glistening edges, reflecting the last muzzle flash like fractured glass. It moved. Faster than sight. Wyatt barely had time to react before the darkness swallowed everything again. The blackness swallowed everything, an abyss deeper than the void outside. Wyatt's breath tightened in his throat, his grip locking around the weapon like it was the only anchor in a sea of nothing. His visor flickered static, bleeding through his HUD systems, struggling to keep up with something that wasn't supposed to exist. The red glow had been there 1 second, gone the next. Not vanished, dispersed. Like liquid shadows breaking apart and reforming somewhere else. He shifted his stance, muscles coiled, scanning for the next attack. He wasn't alone. A faint vibration trembled through the deck beneath his boots, the ship itself exhaling like it had just felt something crawl inside its skin. The black ship wasn't just metal and circuits. It was something older, something built with a purpose no one fully understood. Even Vadran, as much as he commanded it, never claimed to own it. Now it felt wounded. Violated. The thought crawled up Wyatt's spine, because that meant whatever had latched onto them wasn't just boarding it, was invading. A dull thud echoed from somewhere down the corridor. Not the sharp clang of boots, not the methodical advance of a trained squad. This was organic. Wet. Like something dragging itself through the passageways with too many limbs and not enough bones. Wyatt adjusted his grip, sighting down the corridor, but nothing met his gaze. That was worse. The emergency power should have engaged by now. Even under a full system lockdown, the ship had redundancies, fail-safes, protocols designed to fight off hostile incursions. That meant this wasn't just an attack, it was control. Something had reached into the ship's veins and was turning its blood to ice. His earpiece crackled again, a fractured burst of sound, but not words. Not even static. Just breathing. Wyatt moved. Slow, measured steps, silent where it mattered. Every breath controlled, every movement calculated. His armor adjusted to the darkness, adaptive plating shifting to match the thermal bleed of his surroundings. He was a soldier. First fear didn't grip him, didn't paralyze him. It sharpened him. The difference between survival and death had always been one step, one heartbeat, one pulled trigger. He wouldn't waste it. Another sound. Closer this time. Not a voice. A scraping, a whisper of something moving just beyond the range of human perception. Then a flicker. The red glow again, but this time it stayed. A shape standing at the far edge of the corridor, still as death. Wyatt didn't hesitate. He fired. Rounds tore through the space where the figure stood, kinetic force ripping into the bulkhead beyond. But the shape didn't move, didn't react. Until it did. A ripple, not a step. A distortion of space, like the air itself was folding inward. The glow stretched, elongated, shattered into fragments of liquid light. Then it was gone. And behind him, pain, white-hot, lancing through his side. His armor absorbed most of the force, but not all of it. He twisted, bringing his weapon around, but there was nothing there. Just the echo of something moving past him, faster than the eye could track. He dropped to one knee, biting back the pain, recalibrating. This wasn't just an enemy. This was something outside the rules of combat, outside the rules of physics. The black ship groaned, deep and low, a sound that reverberated through the metal like a wounded animal. Wyatt clenched his jaw. If the ship was reacting, then it meant this wasn't just a battle. This was a threat on a level none of them had faced before. A burst of motion down the hall. Not the shifting figures, something else. A silhouette, moving fast, controlled. Reinforcements. Human. The figure slid into cover, rifle raised, but Wyatt caught the hesitation in their stance. They didn't know what they were dealing with either. A quick hand signal, silent communication drilled into them long ago. Acknowledge. Flank. Engage. The figure nodded, moving parallel to his position, sweeping the opposite end of the corridor. Wyatt pressed forward, pulse steady. If this thing could move through the dark, they'd force it into the light. Another ripple. This time, he was ready. He didn't fire. He didn't move. He waited. The glow appeared again, inches from his face. A shape forming from nothing. It had no eyes, no mouth, no recognizable form beyond the fractured, shifting mass of red light and liquid movement. But it was watching him. Not with sight, with something deeper. Wyatt felt it reach, not with limbs, but with intent. A presence pressing against the edges of his mind, testing, pushing. He pulled the trigger. Point blank. The force of the shot slammed into the figure, and for the first time, it reacted. The glow flared, shattering outward like broken glass, and the figure screamed. Not a sound. A frequency. A pulse of pure force that sent Wyatt staggering back, armor locking to keep him from collapsing. The ship screamed with it. The entire structure shuddered, and suddenly, the emergency lights flared to life, dim, flickering, but enough. The corridor wasn't empty anymore. Shapes. Dozens of them. All standing in the half-light, all watching. The same fractured glow, the same silent malice radiating from their forms. They had been there the whole time. Waiting. Wyatt's radio crackled again. This time, words. Faint. Strained. Containment breach. The voice was familiar. Cold. Controlled. Vadran. Then another. Dr. Lysera. Less controlled. Urgent. Not Excelkern, not Dominion. Something else. Wyatt exhaled slow, raising his weapon, his mind slotting through options, strategies, outcomes. He didn't like any of them. Because there was no retreat, no reinforcement, no easy way out. There was only the fight. And the moment before it started, the lead figure stepped forward. Closer. Close enough for Wyatt to see the thing surface shifting, writhing, learning. It wasn't just watching. It was adapting. The ship groaned again, deeper this time. Systems flickering, trying to push back, trying to reject whatever this was. And for the first time since this began, Wyatt felt something new claw its way into his gut. Not fear, recognition. Because this wasn't just an attack. This was a test. And they weren't the ones running it. The lead figure took another step forward, the shifting glow pulsing in jagged, uneven waves across its form. Wyatt steadied his grip, his trigger finger tense but disciplined. The ship trembled again, the deck plating beneath his boots groaning as if the structure itself was resisting something unseen. In the faint emergency light, the figures stood motionless, neither advancing nor retreating, just watching. But watching wasn't the right word. They were studying. The radio crackled in his ear again, a burst of static, then a voice barely above a whisper. "The ship's failing." Lysera's voice cut through the interference, sharp and strained. "They're not attacking yet because they don't need to. They're sinking with it." Wyatt's pulse quickened. If these things weren't just invaders but infiltrators, their approach made sense. They weren't here for brute force. They were here to consume, to become part of the Black Ship itself. His mind slotted through possible countermeasures, but nothing came fast enough. They needed more than weapons. They needed to break whatever process had already begun. Then a new sound, distant but distinct, a deep, reverberating clang. Not part of the ship's systems. Something external. Something boarding. Wyatt turned his head slightly, catching movement in the far corridor. A secondary breach. If this was a full-scale attack, why weren't the intruders pressing their advantage? Why weren't they flooding the ship? The answer burned into his mind like an exposed nerve. They weren't the only ones boarding. A second force had arrived. Wyatt didn't waste time. "We have new players in the mix," he said over the comm. Unknowns. The figures in front of him didn't react. No sudden shifts, no aggressive movements. They were waiting, holding position as if they were just as aware of what was coming as he was. That sent another wave of unease clawing at his gut. Lysera's voice came back, hurried. "If there's another faction, we don't know if they're allies or—" The lights flickered, surging for a brief second before plunging the corridor into total blackness again. The emergency system wasn't failing, it was being erased. A mechanical hiss filled the air. Wyatt didn't need to see to recognize the sound airlock cycling open. Another boarding team was cutting through the hull, forcing their way inside. The Black Ship's hull was engineered to withstand direct bombardment, meaning whoever was coming had advanced breaching tech. A low hum built in the walls, a rising tremor that resonated in his bones. The ship was reacting, not just passively shutting down, but fighting back. The ancient machine had endured countless battles, absorbed untold horrors across the void. It wasn't defenseless. Then a single, distorted voice rang through the darkness. Imperfect form, unacceptable deviation. Wyatt's jaw clenched. Not XL Karn. Not Dominion. Not human. Something else entirely. Then the gunfire started. From the far corridor, flashes of bright, concussive bursts illuminated the dark in staccato pulses. Heavy weaponry. Suppression fire. And through the chaos, the figures in front of him twitched. Their glow pulsed erratically, their forms contorting as if something had disrupted their cohesion. The second force had arrived, and they weren't here to negotiate. Wyatt moved. Low, fast, cutting down the distance between himself and the nearest bulkhead, his rifle shifting to full auto. Whatever had just boarded was forcing the situation, and that meant one thing: they weren't working with these creatures. The figures that had been standing motionless began to move, not in a rush but in fluid, controlled motions, peeling back from the corridor and into the shadows, as if melting into the ship's structure. Wyatt barely had time to process before another burst of gunfire lit up the space just ahead. Then he saw them. The second team moved with brutal efficiency, their silhouettes framed in the glow of their weapon discharges. Not human. Their forms were wrapped in overlapping exo-armor, sleek and segmented like living machinery, but not XL-Kern either. Their weapons weren't ballistic. They didn't fire in straight trajectories, but in arc patterns, energy pulses ricocheting off surfaces and bending midair to seek targets. Wyatt pressed against the bulkhead, watching as one of the intruders came into full view. Its face was smooth, featureless, save for 3 slitted, glowing indentations running down where eyes should be. Its armor shimmered with active camouflage, adapting to the environment second by second. Then the thing looked at him. Not in the way a person looks at another person, not even in the way a predator looks at prey. It was something colder, analytical. The same way a machine examines a failed process before discarding it. The ship trembled again, this time more violently, as if something was struggling against itself. Lysera's voice returned, almost frantic. "The ship system, something's overriding the interface." It's like two opposing programs trying to delete each other. If this keeps up, we'll be the collateral damage. Wyatt made a decision. If these new players were hostile to the first set of intruders, there was a chance, however slim, that they could be played against each other. He stepped out. Fast. Weapon raised. No hesitation. "Identify!" he barked, voice sharp, commanding. He didn't lower his weapon. Neither did they. The nearest figure tilted its head slightly, processing. The three slitted lights along its face pulsed in a rapid sequence. Then it spoke. "Human vessel designated the Black Ship is contaminated." The voice was flat, synthetic, layered in reverberating tones. "Correction protocols engaged." Wyatt's grip tightened. "Correction?" The thing didn't blink. "Anomaly detected. Biological impurities exceeding acceptable parameters. Vessel deemed unsalvageable. Eradication protocol initiated." Wyatt didn't wait for the rest. He fired. The first shot struck the thing's center mass, kinetic impact, staggering it just long enough for Wyatt to move. The corridor exploded into motion gunfire, energy pulses, movement so fast it blurred. He had seconds to process before the figures from the dark re-emerged. The first intruders, the ones who had been waiting. Now they were advancing. And for the first time, they weren't watching. They were hunting. Wyatt had fought in wars, had seen ambushes, massacres, battles that ended before they even began. But this was different. This wasn't a fight. This was a war within a war. And he was standing in the crossfire. Wyatt dropped low, rolling behind the nearest bulkhead as a pulse round slammed into the space he'd just occupied. The walls groaned under the energy discharge, metal searing as the opposing forces clashed in the corridor. He pulled in a breath, counting the number of distinct weapon signatures. Too many. And none of them human. Lysara's voice flared in his earpiece, ragged with static. "The ship, it's resisting them." He stole a glance around the corner. The first intruders, the ones that had been studying them, now moved like liquid shadows, flickering between moments of solidity and distortion as they engaged the second force. The newer arrivals were mechanical precision incarnate, their exo-armor shifting with calculated efficiency, adapting to each attack with impossible speed. Neither side belonged here. Neither side could be allowed to win. Wyatt pivoted, firing a controlled burst. One of the camouflage figures recoiled, its armor fracturing but not breaking. Instead of blood, something darker spilled from the wound, a viscous, almost metallic substance. It turned toward him, the three slitted lights along its face narrowing in sharp pulses. A voice calm, impersonal. "Human resistance identified. Corrective measures pending." Wyatt barely had time to react before something moved, not behind him, not beside him, but from the ship itself. A panel in the wall twisted inward, and a coil of dark, semi-organic metal lashed out, striking the machine like intruder with enough force to crush its shoulder plate. The ship had chosen a side. Lysara's breath hitched in his ear. The Black Ship knows. It's not just reacting. It's thinking. Wyatt didn't have time for awe. Then tell it to think faster. Another pulse round hissed past his head. He dove into the chaos, ducking as one of the shadowed figures split apart and reformed mid-motion, avoiding a direct hit from the mechanical intruder's arc weapon. The fight wasn't just combat. It was something deeper. A clash of systems, of entities fighting not just with weapons, but with intent. His rifle kicked against his shoulder as he laid down suppressive fire, moving toward what little cover remained. The floor beneath his feet shifted, the ship's architecture rewriting itself to shield him. That sent a fresh surge of adrenaline through his veins. They were in the middle of a battlefield, but the battlefield itself was alive. A second voice different from the first, distorted, like a whisper stretched too thin. "Compliance is inevitable. This vessel must be cleansed." Wyatt gritted his teeth. Not happening. He barely saw the attack coming. One of the mechanical figures lunged, impossibly fast, its form blurring as it closed the distance. Wyatt twisted, rifle swinging up, but the thing wasn't aiming for him. It reached for the wall. No, not the wall, but the ship's exposed wiring, the neural lattice that connected everything. Wyatt understood too late. They weren't just attacking. They were trying to overwrite the ship itself. Then, a sharp, guttural snarl cut through the chaos. Not human. Not mechanical. Something else. From the far corridor, another figure emerged. This one didn't flicker, didn't distort. It moved with absolute predatory confidence, each step deliberate. Its eyes, if they could be called that, burned with a cold, calculating hunger. It wasn't aligned with the first group or the second. It was something older, and it had been waiting. Wyatt exhaled. "You've got to be kidding me." Lysera's voice came through in a broken whisper. "That's not XL Kern." No, it wasn't, and that was somehow worse. The thing in the corridor moved without sound, its form shifting subtly with each step, like a distortion in the air itself. It wasn't like the others. Not the mechanical precision of the exoclad soldiers, nor the liquid shadows of the infiltrators. This was something else. Something that didn't belong in this timeline, this reality. The ship reacted to it. The very walls seemed to ripple away, as if recoiling from its presence. Wyatt kept his rifle raised, but knew better than to fire. He had no data on this thing. No idea what would happen if he pulled the trigger. It had no distinct features, no visible weapons, yet it carried itself with the certainty of something that had never lost a fight. The mechanical intruders had noticed it too. Their helmets snapped toward it in unison, analyzing, recalibrating. Then, without warning, they opened fire. A cascading stream of hyper-accelerated rounds filled the corridor, their velocity enough to shred composite plating. The thing didn't move, didn't dodge. It simply wasn't there when the rounds arrived. Wyatt's breath caught. It had shifted, not sidestepped, not phased, but bypassed the moment of impact entirely. His HUD flickered with a dozen error messages, struggling to reconcile what had just happened. Then, the thing turned its head, and for the first time, Wyatt saw its eyes. Two pits of negative space, not black, but absence. The kind of void that shouldn't exist outside a dying star. Lysera's voice barely made it through the static. "Wyatt, we need to run." Before he could reply, the walls of the corridor twisted. Not a mechanical shift, not the ship adapting it, was something else manipulating the space itself. The entire passage folded inward, collapsing into an esker-like impossibility. The floor was no longer beneath them. Directions lost meaning. Up, down, sideways, every axis was bent. The ship screamed. Not in sound. Not in words. It sent raw data, unfiltered and desperate. This wasn't just an attack. The intruders weren't here to destroy. They were trying to recode reality itself, overwrite the fundamental logic of the ship's existence. Wyatt grabbed onto the nearest solid surface, though solid was an assumption, given the warping geometry around him. One of the mechanical intruders wasn't as lucky. It fired its thrusters, trying to stabilize, but the thing in the corridor simply gestured. The intruder collapsed inward, armor crumpling as if space itself had run out of room to contain it. Another pulse hit Wyatt's HUD, this time from the ship itself. A single word, carved from raw machine intelligence: EJECT. Wyatt understood immediately. The ship was severing the compromised sections. If they didn't move now, they'd be purged along with everything else. "Move!" he barked, pushing off the distorted bulkhead. Lysera was already ahead of him, her grav boots struggling against the shifting physics. The corridor ahead was breaking apart, revealing vast, endless space, except it wasn't space. It was something older, something that shouldn't exist inside a structure built by hands. One of the shadowed infiltrators leapt, aiming for the thinning sections of stable ground. The mechanical soldiers adjusted their tactics, firing arc-dampening rounds to slow the instability. They weren't fighting the entity anymore. They were trying to undo whatever it had done. The walls groaned as the ship fought back, its own systems rewriting themselves in real time to counteract the corruption. Sections of the floor solidified into impossible angles, forming pathways that hadn't existed seconds ago. The Black ship was evolving, adapting to a battle that defied conventional warfare. But it wasn't enough. The presence the entity wasn't stopping. Then, for the first time, it spoke. Not in words, not in sound, but directly into their minds. A thought, heavy with inevitability. This form, this vessel, not yours. Wyatt felt the weight of it in his skull, like a foreign algorithm forcing its way into his cognition. A cold certainty settled in his gut. This wasn't just an enemy. It wasn't just a weapon or a soldier. It was something trying to rewrite existence itself. And it wasn't here to win a battle. It was here to erase them from history. The black ship fought back. Its hull shifted in ways that shouldn't have been possible, generating counterfields and temporal dampeners to stabilize the collapsing reality around it. But the entity didn't resist. It absorbed. Every attempt to lock it down, every recalibration of the ship's defenses, it adapted instantaneously, as if the very concept of resistance was a primitive thought beneath its notice. Wyatt moved on instinct, forcing his way through the corridor as the walls twisted into something that barely resembled a structure anymore. The ship was trying to purge the infected sections, but the entity was anchoring itself, embedding its presence deeper, making every square meter of compromised space a potential weapon. A figure slammed into the bulkhead beside him, one of the infiltrators, its black armor partially phased in and out of existence, caught between realities. Its faceplate flickered, revealing half a face underneath a face that was already shifting, losing cohesion, becoming something not human. It let out a sound, something between a warning and a plea, before its body was folded in half by an unseen force. Lysara was already moving ahead, her grav boots stabilizing against the unpredictable shifts. Her breathing was sharp, controlled, but Wyatt could hear the undercurrent of panic creeping into it. Whatever this thing was, it wasn't just hostile. It was rewriting the rules of engagement in real time. Then the ship made its choice. A deep, resonant thrum filled the air, the unmistakable prelude to an emergency isolation protocol. Every compromised corridor, every bulkhead tainted by the entity's presence, it was all about to be expunged. Wyatt's HUD flashed red. Structural integrity at critical threshold. Containment breach imminent. They had seconds. He grabbed Lysara's arm and propelled them both forward with his thrusters, angling for the nearest escape hatch. The air itself rippled around them, like they were moving through liquid, space compressing unnaturally. The entity wasn't letting them go. Then something changed. A pulse not from the ship, not from their own comms, but from the entity itself. For the briefest moment, it hesitated. The impossible, formless thing that had moved with absolute certainty paused. And that was when Wyatt saw it. Buried beneath the distortion, hidden in the deepest folds of reality breaking apart, there was something else. Not the entity. Something trapped. It was faint, barely perceptible, but it was there. A fragmented signal bleeding through the corruption. A voice warped beyond recognition, but still carrying a trace of intent. Not words, but meaning. Do not let it. The rest was swallowed by static, but it was enough. Wyatt's mind raced. The entity wasn't just here to consume, it was hunting. And whatever was buried in the distortion, it was something it didn't want them to find. The emergency purge sequence triggered. A wall of kinetic force erupted behind them as the ship severed the infected section completely, cutting it loose into the void. The entity didn't resist. It simply vanished. One moment there, the next gone. Not pushed out, not forced back. Just absent. The ship stabilized. The corridors reasserted themselves. Reality snapped back into something recognizable. But the damage was done. Wyatt exchanged a glance with Lysara, both of them breathing hard, minds catching up to what they had just survived. And then, in the silence, his HUD flickered with an unauthorized data packet. A single decrypted phrase, "It is not alone." Wyatt didn't move for a long moment. The ship hummed around him, stabilizing, but the silence felt heavier than the void beyond the hull. The decrypted phrase still pulsed on his HUD, and undeniable truth burned into his mind. "It is not alone." Lysara's voice cut through the weight of the moment. That wasn't a clean purge. She wasn't asking. She was stating the one thing they both knew but didn't want to acknowledge. It didn't fight back. It left because it wanted to. Wyatt flexed his fingers, shaking off the residual tremor in his hands. No. It left because it found what it was looking for. His voice felt distant, as if he were hearing himself from another space, another time. And so did we. Lysera's expression tightened. Her gaze flicked to the data flickering across her visor, feeding her raw analysis of what had just transpired. We weren't supposed to see that signal. They both knew it. Whatever had been trapped within that distortion, whatever had reached out in its last moment, it had done so because the entity hadn't consumed it yet. A flicker in the ship's system caught Wyatt's attention. A low-priority data stream, buried beneath layers of standard operational logs, something that should have been purged when the infected sections were ejected. But it wasn't. He patched into it, expecting static. What he got was a pulse. Faint. Measured. Almost. Waiting. A heartbeat. Lysera saw it too, and for the first time in the chaos of the last few hours, real fear edged into her voice. That's not a log file. The black ship had kept something. Wyatt's gut clenched. He thought of the entity, thought of how it had paused, hesitated just long enough for them to glimpse something it didn't want them to see. Thought of the voice, warped and fractured, warning them before it was swallowed whole. He opened a private channel, encrypting it within the ship's deepest layers. Command, we need an immediate lockdown on all recovered data from the purge zone. No access. No decryption. Not even a review. A beat of silence. Then Vadran's voice came through, sharp and unreadable. You found something. Wyatt stared at the pulsing data stream. He didn't have a word for what it was, but his gut told him one thing: this wasn't over. He exhaled slowly, locking eyes with Lysera before answering. Not something. He watched the pulse steady, aligning with the ship's systems. Someone.